Please be seated. It's 5 o'clock Friday afternoon at Children's Hospital. A young child with vague symptoms presents to the radiology department just as I'm almost out the door to go home after a long week. A routine ultrasound shows a large abdominal mass that most assuredly is cancer, the bad kind. I try to tell the mom we need more tests and walk them to the emergency department to her pediatric resident and staff and suggest next steps. The patient who presents at 5 o'clock on Friday routinely has a serious illness. Their mother has just gotten off work and noticed that there's something wrong when she hugs her. My day at the hospital is extended, and I soon learn in my medical practice to pay attention to these interruptions. Another physician who calls or comes to see me usually has something more important than the issue I am working on. I hope I was as available to medical students, but probably not always. I identify with one of Henry Nouwen's stories. While visiting his University of Notre Dame, he meets with an older professor. And as they stroll the campus, the professor tells him with a certain melancholy, "You know, my whole life I have been complaining that my work is constantly interrupted, until I finally discovered that my interruptions were my work." Living a life of interruptions is not easy. I always have a to-do list like most of you, and I rarely get through it. There was a time in my practice as I became more successful when my thoughts began to be filled with hubris. I'm a very important doctor. I need someone to screen these interruptions. I'll call them back at my convenience. But I soon learned I miss opportunities to help or heal or learn more crucial information about a child I'm evaluating if I don't stop to listen. Jesus' life is one of constant interruptions. I don't know how he does it. Today we hear one more story of the constant daily intrusions into his life. Our story starts with Jesus interrupting Matthew as he sits at the tax booth. The Pharisees then ungraciously interrupt their dinner by critically asking the disciples why Jesus eats with sinners and tax collectors. Note that they make triangles and do not ask Jesus directly. But Jesus hears them and interrupts their triangulation, suggesting their clock is wound up backwards. He quotes words from the prophet Hosea that we just heard. Jesus' mission is to heal wounds, show mercy, forgive sins, not minister to those who think they are well. When Jesus tries to finish the best meal he's had all week, he's suddenly interrupted by a synagogue leader. He kneels before him, pleading that his daughter has died. Come and lay hands on her, and she will live. Jesus instantly leaves the table to go with him. And then suddenly a woman who has been hemorrhaging for 12 years interrupts their abortive journey by touching the fringe of his cloak. Jesus turns around and heals her. Take heart, daughter. Your faith has healed you. Jesus then interrupts the customary paid mourners around the dead child's home and interrupts the young girl's sleep as he takes her by the hand and brings her back to the living. Jesus meets people where they are, living or dead, not where he is. He operates in the present moment. No call waiting or call back later or make an appointment. Again, how does he do it? He gets help. He has at least 12 followers, but after their 3-year residency, they don't seem ready to take their specialty boards. We never hear Jesus' weekend vacations to recharge. But we do hear about his attempts to sleep on boat rides and is again interrupted. But he does like to eat, always at other people's homes. He reinforces how meals build relationships. Food nourishes and changes our bodies, but also nourishes relationships in some way that is not the same as simply sitting together around a table and talking. And today we also hear that Jesus eats with sinners like ourselves. So how does Jesus heal in these constant interruptions? Miracle stories always produce more questions than answers. Jesus touches, especially outcasts. His interaction is personal. His presence may be something like what I've experienced with a handful of people in my lifetime. When you talk with them, you feel like you are the only person in the room. You have their total attention, and you begin to live in the present moment with them. How does Jesus have the energy to do all this without a break in these constant interruptions? Look more closely at the healing stories. Does Jesus say, "I have healed you"? Today it is, "Your faith has made you well." What about raising the child from death? Was it the faith of her father that brought about the miracle? Jesus never mentions for people to let others know that he, the great physician, performs the miracle. Jesus models that he is so connected to God the Father that he has become a channel of God's power to love and heal each person he meets, whatever he is doing. We've previously learned that this resurrected Christ is also within us. This is huge. That power of love and healing is now within us. How does Jesus stay connected to this love and healing power? We know how it happens. There are almost 30 verses in the New Testament where Jesus goes off to a quiet place and prays. When I tire of the interruptions in my life, I know this is a true sign that I'm not connected to God's love, particularly in my prayer life. I must stop and reboot my rule of life. My experience is I have an agenda, but I'm slowly, often painfully learning that God continually meets me in the interruptions in my life. When I ignore a call from a friend or a family member, when I think I am too busy to talk, this is a sure sign that I am in trouble, losing priority of what life is all about. Interruptions are like stop or yield signs to go off script and listen for a grace note. Nouwen calls them opportunities for radical hospitality, and novel experiences. When I return to a project after an interruption, I usually have fresh ideas, but that false notion keeps speaking in my ear that if I stop, I will lose my creativity or train of thought. Interruptions remind us of how powerless we are. If we think we're in charge, interruptions remind us this is a myth. When I seal myself off and refuse to respond to anything but what is on my schedule, I become exponentially isolated. My world, my God, becomes too small. I become the center of the universe and fossilized. That is when I develop that high hubris tighter. When we're open to the interruptions in our lives, we begin to see miracles happening all around us. In medicine, in recovery groups, healing which interrupts lives when all seems hopeless. Those desperately caught in an addiction go into recovery. A child or an adult survives an infectious disease like tuberculosis or diphtheria or cancer that would have killed them 50, 10, or 5 years ago. The child I first meet on a Friday at 5 today has a chance. Interruptions always bring us back to live in the present moment where God likes to abide. We become aware of what's happening directly around us in our life instead of living into what is going on in our heads, in the past, or the future. One last story reminds me about the power of God's love, the resurrected Christ within us, that we now share when we live into the interruptions presented to us in our surroundings. Living as Jesus in the present moment where miracles happen. The resurrected Christ within us in each present moment reaffirms the incarnation, the Word made flesh. We now connect to the presence of the divine risen one within us. Richard Seltzer, distinguished Yale surgeon, wrote in his book, Mortal Lessons, about operating on a young woman with a cancerous growth on her cheek. Unfortunately, he must cut the nerve controlling the muscles of her mouth. Looking at her misshapen mouth in the mirror, she asked him, "Will this always be this way?" He replies, "Yes." She then nods and lies there quietly. But her young husband quickly bends over her, smiles, and says, "I like it." Then he shapes his mouth to hers and kisses her to show that their kiss still works. Seltzer writes that in that brief moment, he is looking through an open window into the healing presence of the living God. And of course he is, because the work of the great physician comes to us in the twisted shapes and interruptions in our lives, to shape his love to fit us and to pour his love into us. May this healing power be yours.